I'm Natania Barron, author of fantasy novellas and novels and short fiction. You can find me at nataniabarron.com, and from there you can find all my social media stuff, which is mostly at Natania Barron, so kind of easy. I'm going to start reading a fight scene from my novella Wolfwood. This scene is when two characters who've been separated since the beginning are actually meeting up with each other sort of for the first time, and they have to attack something terrible. Now, this is a weird, heroic fantasy novella, which I know sounds like a lot of things in one book, but I really wanted to do kind of compressed world building and really focus on the characters, so it's actually multi-point of view on top of that, even though it's relatively slim. So, by way of a little background, it's kind of a medieval setting. There are a group of people called the Brejans who are sort of modeled after medieval Bretons. So, they live in the woods, they have horses, they do some agriculture. There's no metal, really. Metal disappeared about 100, 200 years ago. And so everything is glass weaponry or flint and stone. So the sort of technological world has been limited. There's a little bit of metal, and it's only for tinkers to use. They make little, tiny, very elaborate work things, but otherwise it doesn't exist. So they are currently with the Revens, who are trying to take over their territory in a nice way. Like, they all know they're trying to just take them over, but they're kind of being nice. And Glenn and Bell, who is the chieftain, they call her Mormare of her particular tribe, is trying to meet out to these people and sort of, be a good emissary, and then something happens. So, let's start. Bravery came naturally to Glenn and Bell. Big strokes, high stakes. As long as she could recall, she was constantly poised to attack, to share a witty remark, to command with passion and strength. But now she was having a crisis of self, a meddling doubt that twisted at her as she waited for Breg Van to come to her in the small clearing north of the camp. She'd sent Kajigo to fetch him. The two of them had grown up together, fought together. He'd trust her. But now she was doubting the whole thing, blaming Per Maddock for his secret meetings and scandalous smile, blaming herself for leaving Breg to die, blaming the entirety of Theria for her problems. Maybe if she'd gone the original route, none of this would have happened. If she hadn't listened to her mother time and again, if her mother hadn't been so obsessed with fate. Maybe it wasn't fate. Maybe it was the Wolfwood itself, reaching out to strangle her, waiting to kill her. For a moment she felt tendrils around her heart squeezing. Fear of the dark, fear of death, fear of everything stopping. Ceasing to be Glenn and Bell, turning back to dust and dirt. She was supposed to put her faith in Nodoret, believe that when her death came, as Mormare, that she would be given a place at her side in the eternal Casten. Except that was even more terrifying than dying. She shivered under her furs, gripping the braided bracelets around her gauntlets and yanking them off, throwing them to the ground. Her hands were sweating so hard they were practically chafing. She hated the feelings of gloves anyway. Always had. And if Breg was coming armed, gauntlets were the least of her concerns. Out of the corner of her eye, she thought she saw wings again, but she blinked, and it was Breg Van, Lon as he called himself now, standing a few paces away from her, stock still. Kajigo was a few steps behind him, trying to keep from smiling. Yuri sniffed the air as her bodyguard. "Well, there you are, Breg," he said at last. "Kaj here has always bemoaned the fact that her best sparring partner went off and got himself gored to death, but now we might have to rethink that. It's good to see you." Breg nodded and almost smiled. Glennon watched Breg emerge and noticed immediately that he came without armor, though that didn't stop him from looking impressive. She looked for lines of familiarity in his gait and manner, but so much about him had changed. Earlier he'd been high up on her horse, and he'd even been a good distance from her. The details were hard to make out, though she'd never mistake the voice, even if it was lower than it had been. Now, though, she could see all the ways that he had changed, and all the ways he had stayed the same. His eyes were still a little dull, but they were deeper than she remembered them, lined around the edges. Most of his face was carved in ways she would never imagined, having frozen him as a teenager in her mind. What was once a rather plain face was made more striking and strangely foreign without the beard. But there was no mistaking him, even though 1,000 things had changed. The vessel remained the same. Her cousin Breg, with whom she'd shared a nursemaid in almost every day of her life until the age of 14. There was no denying his size, either. When they were younger, Glennon would shield herself from his praise by saying he was only big for their village, that when he went out to the world he wouldn't be so big in comparison. But he was a head taller than Kajigo, and considerably broader than Yuri, who was both mountainous among the Bright Banner clan. Though he wasn't as bulky as he was during the years of training at Bannercliff, his body had grown more lean and nimble with time, and practice, probably a lot of that. "Mormare Bell," he said to her, once she let the silence go a little too long. That voice! It made her shiver. "I'm honored that you would speak with me." No sarcasm, no irony in the tone. It sounded so damned honorable she wanted to strike him. I don't know what to call you, she said, willing her voice still. It worked, and she was glad of it. Her confidence returned slowly. Brig is fine if you can't say lawn, she said. The word meant bore in the old tongue. She got the joke twice over. Glennon could hear Kajigo's leather creaking behind him. Given the opportunity, her money was still on Brig, though. God, as she had forgotten just how big he was. Even when he wasn't trying to be frightening, he was. She remembered that night when he was drunk and he came so close to her and the things that he said. Kaj, Yuri, can you check the perimeter? I want to speak to Brig alone, Glennon said to her guards. She sounded far more certain than she felt, but she had trained in hard diplomacy as she had trained in combat. The Kesten guards nodded and departed in the opposite direction. She knew that Yuri wouldn't go that far, but it was worth a shot. When she was sure they were at least out of hearing range, she went to say something, but then thought better. So it was Brig who spoke first. We're not far from where we saw that boar, Brig said, taking a few steps around their meeting spot. It was a small clearing with a little fire, the dim morning light casting their bodies in hues of blue and gray. Are we? Glennon asked, even though she knew well enough. Wouldn't you call that fate? Said Brig, letting out a mirthless laugh. Your mother would. She would have, she said. You learned so well from her, Glennon. I think so. Hard to believe she's been gone 10 years now, isn't it? No, it's not hard. I miss her every day. It never stops hurting. Brig frowned. I suppose that's true. You lived with the reminders. I ran from them. That's an interesting perspective. It's the truth. Is Bannercliff the same? He asked. In my mind, it's preserved in amber. I hardly believed it was you on that horse, not some gawky teenager. Bannercliff is the same as it always was, she replied, her voice as chilly as she could make it. A boring town run by boring people with boring problems. Well, sometimes boring is good. It means you're safe. You call this safe? She asked, gesturing toward the wolfwood. You're a fool, Brig. Brig did smile this time, scratching the back of his head as he paced. You've changed, that's for sure. And you're right. I am a fool, and I've made peace with it. You, though, you're something else out there, like a goddess of old. For a second, I thought I'd see fire sprout from your eyes. Are those kando blades? They are, she said, swallowing back a surge of pride. He wasn't playing her, trying to sneak around subjects, twist her emotions. She wouldn't have it. Fine weapons. Enough of the banter. Glennon turned to face him, eyes narrowed as if he were her prey. You could have turned the whole army against me last night. He finally stopped his pacing, turning toward her to look her in the eye. You're not really sorry, are you? He asked. I'm more Mayor Bell. I don't have time for apologies. Glennon did not let her features betray her, though her words threw her. She remained as expressionless as if she'd been carved into black marble. You never contacted us. You never came back. I presumed you were dead. The Brig Van you remember is dead, but I didn't. Just because I didn't actually die doesn't mean he's not dead. So you've gone Tinkner. I've adopted some of their philosophies, for certain. I found it freeing to take life less seriously, to detach myself. Something moved above them. Then he froze. She froze too, both poised for attack, years of training springing into action before thought. There was a sound like the chattering of a million teeth, a change in pressure as if they'd mounted a hill too fast. Glennon's ears immediately began ringing too, like that time she'd had a fever as a child and almost died. She could taste the sick again, smell the stink of death all around her. The fear of it sank into her bones before she was even aware of what was going on. A kind of sparkling blackness pricked at the edges of her vision, and she could feel her whole body sing out in reply, fighting against the overwhelming desire she had to just fall upon the ground and give up. Brig was not well either. She blinked over toward him, saw his mouth slack, his brows knit over his eyes. He had the wherewithal to have drawn his spear, but against what? There was nothing around them but air. Then Yuri crashed through the trees, entwined in what looked like a silvery cloud at first. But then Glennon got a closer look. It was made up of teeth, rows of them in an invisible mouth, moving and twisting in whirls around his head and his arms, gnashing and rolling impossibly. There was no form to it, no sense, just a madness that sent Glennon's hands trembling. Her whole body went rigid with fear and wrongness. Yuri stumbled in toward them, swatting and grunting at the swarm, and when he saw Glennon, he opened his mouth, but it was just a myriad of tiny, glittering teeth, continually rearranging themselves, blood frothing with the silvery stuff. Yuri, fight this, she cried, her blades up at the ready. Please, goddess, it was not worth this. She did not want to kill her friend, but perhaps he was already dead. Brig faltered. He blinked as if waking himself from a dream and then threw himself forward, only to come to a quick stop as Yuri fell to the ground before them, clawing at his face, his fingers raw with the effort. The teeth were shredding him alive before their eyes. chewing his flesh from his bones with startling swiftness, sending blood spray in every direction. The sight of it, watching the man evaporate before their eyes, and leather and metal and everything else, left them both gasping and sick, unsteady on their own feet. Glennon dropped one of her blades from her hand, and her hand trembled so. They would die. They would fail. Glennon reached out and touched Brave's shoulder because she needed to steady herself more than anything. But to her surprise, he put her hand on hers, clasping her fingers tight. And in that touch, the world became clear. Brutal, but clear. And they were both flushed with a kind of warm, deep understanding. The nausea lifted. The dizziness abated. They locked eyes, nodded. They needed to be touching, had to be. Something about their connection cut through the fear. It would mean that Glennon would have to fight with her offhand, but she'd trained enough to know her way around it fairly well. You couldn't master the art of kendo blades without knowing how. Looking over at the swarm, Glennon noticed a pattern now. It was like a flower, coming down from a narrow passageway above them and then blooming out. At the very edge, there was a source, if it could be called that, a concentration point. Forward they moved without speaking, Brake holding aloft his sword, more like one might a shield, protectively. Glennon felt a growing warmth where their hands met, a kind of pulsing that wasn't altogether distressing. It was as if there was something else tying them together beside their own strength. Getting to her feet, under her, was a little more difficult than she would have hoped, but given the circumstances, she was relieved. "Don't let go," she said to Brake, as he nodded curtly as if he'd already made that connection 10 times over. "Whatever you do." "Is that a request?" he said through a tight jaw. "It's an order." They moved as one toward the storm, both looking for an opening in the churning madness, hoping they could find an advantage. But then the game changed again. Silver streams of sharp fragments rose, twisted, and then Yuri through his nostrils, his mouth, his eyes, his ears. For a moment his skull was lit so bright his skin glowed like a candle wax before flame. A buzzing sound began, rattling Glennon's mail. She shuddered against it, moving back a step with Brake in tow. Then Yuri rose. The borders of his body swelled as the swarm filled him, his leather jerkin puffing up and spilling out of his collar, his shoulders rising, his head gaining mass like a boil ready to burst. Yuri, her friend, a face she had known since they played together in old Bruce's herb house, raised along with her to be her guard and her protector. Now this, whatever this was. Glennon knew without question that he was dead. He was gone, and that his body before her, growing sickeningly large before her eyes, was not him. It was her duty to destroy him. As Mormere of the bright banner, as her mother before her, she was the flame in the dark. So as the creature that was Yuri rose, his two-sided axe along with him, Glennon didn't hesitate. She'd had enough of a warrior's instinct to close the chamber of her heart where Yuri had been, to seal away a lifetime of memories and feelings and attack. Brake twisted aside and dropped his spear on purpose, reclaiming the shield Yuri had dropped. It was a better option, and she gave him the slightest of nods. In this way, they could have more cover as they approached the beast. Like a strange turtle, they moved forward, Brake at the fore, holding up the shield and buffeting the stray teeth that clattered toward them as if pulled by invisible force. They plinked off like hail. The kendo blade was long enough and the angle just manageable that Glennon could strike out when needed. It wasn't hard to find a good opening. The creature that inhabited Yuri's body was a clumsy, unaccustomed to such confines. But slashing through his arm, even with an excellent aim, considering the poor positioning, was like cutting through sand. It just reformed again, the cloth and skin falling off in ragged slices. "Going to need to rethink this approach," breathed Brake, so close to her ear it tickled. They were both getting tired, and even though their hands had grown slick with sweat, neither had loosened their grip. He was going to say something more, but Glennon swung around and aimed to take a good chunk off the side of the creature's head. The attack was true, but it made almost no impact. She felt a shudder run through her as the teeth scraped against her blade, vibrating all the way up her arm and setting her jaw against it. The reaction was enough to ruin their flow, however. A big, studded fist caught her in the chin, sending her back crashing over Brake. Her foot caught again, twisting her ankle and making it crunch, and her elbow hit his nose with an equally brittle response. Their hands flew apart, and they both landed on their backs. Both were up in mere moments, but they were lost to the horror now. The sound of it, that was even more than the appearance, and the smell, too. Somehow with their hands together they had avoided these two senses, but now Glennon felt an unbearable urge to vomit, her hands trembling so much that she doubted she could make another blow. At least her other blade was nearby. She scrambled to grab it. Brake charged forward, wobbling on his legs like he was drunk. He had nothing but the shield he was carrying, and he used this to buffet the blows from the creature as he tried to kick his legs out from under him. But it might as well have been made of smoke for all the good it did. Up went one of Yuri's swollen arms, chunks of flesh evaporating as it continued roiling of shards churned beneath the remnants of his clothing, and then down on Braid's back. Glennon hissed sharply, seeing how quickly the blow sent him to the ground. That huge man, that trained and dangerous man, flat on the ground, blood pooling around his chin. She shook her head, hoping to dispel some of the incessant whining around. It did not work, and then charged forward, both kendo blades in her trembling hands, her feet pumping furiously to mark the space between them and prevent a killing blow to Braid, if it wasn't finished already. Before she even reached the creature, it had coiled around her, one arm snaking like a tentacle, wrapping around her waist and squeezing her tight. Cutting through her mail, slipping under her armor, slicing through to her skin. She would be cut in half, she knew it, sliced as perfectly as a presented boar for a feast day. And she hadn't even set foot in the Wolfwood yet. That's why I'm going to stop that fight. There is more to it. But if you want to find that out, you can read later. So this book is Frost and Filigree, very different in tone and style from this other book. This is a urban fantasy set in Gilded Age New York, where the monsters are the heroes. They're kind of like League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, but with monsters. So La Belle Dame Sans Merci and the Lamia are the two main characters, Vivian and Nerissa. They fight off this unspeakable evil in this book, but in the process, Vivian is captured at the end of this book. So in the second book, Masked and Malevolence, they go from Tarrytown, New York to Cairo, Egypt, which was really fascinating to research. And they are trying to assemble a crew to kind of free Vivian from this mad released genie that she had captive, who then turned and took her. And in the process, they are trying to get Nerissa better food. Nerissa is a lamia, and she drinks blood, and it's very hard to travel when you have to drink fresh blood all the time. So when they were in New York, she had her own goats, and she could drink whenever she wanted to. But now they're traveling, it's a bit hard, and they're tricked into taking with them a kitsune, who's supposed to be which is a Japanese fox creature who's been enslaved to this goddess, and so to pay off her debts, she has to be sort of an indentured servant and slave, really, and they get tricked into it because they're not super bright. And now they're back at their hotel, which is called the Semiramis, which was this amazing hotel on the banks of the Nile in the 20s that was knocked down and rebuilt, but it was called a monster hotel, which I thought was amazing because my monsters are all there, and I was like, that could not be more perfect. And Christabel is the only smart, really, really intelligent of these people. She's actually also a unicorn, which she finds out at the end of this book. And so she's super smart. She grew up around humans. She didn't know that she was this being until much later. And she's now having to deal with the aftermath of being in a house this hotel with Nerissa, who's grumpy because she hasn't had good food in ages, with the kitsune, and with Worth, the guy that she can't be with because she's a unicorn, so you can't have sexual relationships with Worth, who is the questing beast, so he also body shifts and changes. So they're quite the motley crew of people. This is a chapter where they're back in the hotel, and this is sort of Christabel's first introduction, as well as our introduction to Kit, the kitsune. Christabel has been the best hope in finding Vivian, not just because she moves more easily among mortals, but because she has a mind for deduction rather than action, which cannot be said for either of her counterparts. In fact, the bulk of clues leading toward Vivian in the last 10 years have been at the hand of Christabel Crane. To be fair, being a unicorn has a rather impressive set of advantages other monsters simply cannot comprehend. It isn't balance, but a fact of life. Christabel is pure of soul and of body, and so mortals trust her implicitly. It has led to more than her fair share of marriage requests, it's true, but it's also opened many doors and spurred many fascinating conversations. Once the Cairo lead came through, Nerissa insisted they all travel together, and Christabel warned against it. A lamia without a food source is dangerous enough. A reformed lamia in the streets of Cairo is quite another story. Her primary concern is now that Nerissa is no longer feeding off goats, she will revert to her predatory ways. If she had it her way, Christabel would be far from such a hot, dry place as Cairo. She'd be in a library in London or Paris surrounded by books. She can easily shift her form to reflect the beauty standards of the day. Now, she wears her hair cropped short to her ears, darker than when she was in Tarrytown, her clothing comfortable, a midi blouse, pleated skirt, and flowing cardigan in ivory. In 10 years, the fashion has changed a great deal, but she's most certainly glad to be done with corsets. What Vivian would say about these clothes? She would be thrilled. The stab of sadness gets her, fresh as it did the day Vivian was taken. Vivian was captured because of her, because she hadn't figured out what she herself was at the very source of the mad monster's hunt. And that she loved Worth, loves him still, and a part of her, a very strange, uncomfortable part, is afraid if they find Vivian again, she will take him away. When there's a knock on the door, Christabel knows it's Worth, but she goes to answer him anyway. "I'm still getting used to the way you look," he says when she opens the door. It wouldn't be appropriate to let him in, so she remains in the doorway. "Getting used to the way I look?" she asks. "I can grow out the hair again. I just blend in better when I'm a la mode." He grins, and she loves the way that his human face, tanned and freckled from his time in the sun, dimples just below the eyes. She doesn't tell him this because she's been very clear that she has absolutely no romantic interests. Except that's the problem with unicorns. To love him, to make love to him or anyone would be the end of her. At least that's what she's gleaned from the research she's found. Worth understands this, but it doesn't stop their longing, awkward pauses together, like now. "Are you alone?" Christabel asks. "For the moment." Christabel sighs, relieved. She doesn't hide her frustrations of Nerissa in front of Worth. "You could try to get to know her, you know. She isn't so bad once you get past everything." "There is no getting to know Nerissa Waldemar. She is physically repulsed by my very existence." "I suppose that's a legitimate hurdle, but once she isn't hungry all the time, I take it you found her a more portable meal source then?" Worth purses his lips, and Christabel knows a dozen things in that simple expression, the least of which is that she will be very unhappy with whatever has transpired. Venturing into that part of the city with little protection was dangerous enough. Heaven knows what they've gotten themselves into this time. But it was better than vampires, so at least there was that. Still, the abattoir network made her cringe. "It didn't go exactly as planned," Worth says, looking behind him as if expecting a specter to jump out at them both. He looks more like an embarrassed paramour than a great, impressive creature, as he ought. That bothers Christabel considerably. He is more happy in his human skin, she thinks, though he never would admit it. Christabel forces a smile. "I'm sure it's not as bad as that." "Oh, it is. It's as bad as that. Worse." "Worse?" "You see, we may have ended up with... I think there was some magic involved, and before we knew what happened, we ended up with... me!" This proclamation comes not from Worth, but from behind Christabel. In her own room, from a small creature with shiny black hair and dark eyes shaped like narrow leaves. But that doesn't explain how she got into the room, or the enthusiasm behind her declaration of servitude. "You could call me a slave, but this one doesn't like the way it sounds," she said. "Stop using that word," Worth says, exasperated, "and stop going into rooms you're not supposed to be in." The woman grins, baring all her teeth. "You said we were visiting the unicorn. You didn't say I couldn't go into her room. I thought that visiting someone predicated upon actually staying with them, not lingering wistfully at their doors for half an hour before summoning up the courage to knock." Worth tries to make words, but his nerves are too shot with embarrassment for anything coherent. Christabel almost laughs. "Does she always talk like this?" Christabel asks, as she watches the curious guest make herself comfortable on one of the divans. "Her name is Kit," Worth finally manages. "She's a kitsune." "Ah, a wily fox," Christabel says. She has spent her life dedicated to understanding fey creatures, categorizing them, and gleaning what she can be found. Still, the kitsune is fairly rare, especially this far out of East Asia. "I heard you," Kit says from the other room. "She always does," Worth says with a sigh. "What does she know?" Christabel asks. "Almost everything," Worth says. "Details aside, she knows we're looking for Vivian, but we've kept everything else rather vague." "I'm not sure how you found herself with her. Contracted, is it?" Christabel asks. Worth explains how he and Nerissa ended up with the kitsune, and Christabel immediately regrets not having gone with them. But a Shadavar? That is why she suggested to them that she ought to undergo more training to better deduce glamours and charms, but they're both stubborn and consider themselves experts already. It is hardest to teach a calcified mind, and neither are willing to admit that she, younger and far less experienced in the field, could ever offer more than cursory warnings or at worst paranoid ravings. "What did I tell you about Cairo?" Christabel presses. Worth rolls his eyes. "That the Fae is different here." "Yes, and it's not even called the Fae. And as much as you're on a different continent, you're also on a different plane of existence. You're far from the powers that make you who you are, and so you need to look more than with your eyes. You need to feel your way through these situations. I suggest you bring it back, explain to the Shadavar, who would be very ashamed of himself for such duplicitous behavior, and ask for an exchange." "I can still hear you," Kit calls from the other room. Christabel is quite certain that with some kind of vermin scuttling around, and Kit has dispensed with it, but she's not keen on taking a look. "And I don't want to go back." "Then you too should be ashamed," Christabel says. "We have no need of meddling kitsune." Kit curls her fingers around the door jamb and peeks in, her hair falling in a straight line away from her face. Ah, but you do need a guide. Not even clever unicorns know all the alleyways in Cairo, or even what they call the Fae in Cairo, though she does act as if she does. Duat is the closest, but even that isn't quite right, because Duat is many places. She cackles and holds up a dead rat by the tail, asking Worth, "Do you think the Gorgon will like this?" "She's not a Gorgon, she's a Lamia," Worth insists, and Christabel consents it is not the first time he's had to correct her. "And we don't meet with her soon. She's going to be so hungry she might eat both of us." Christabel wonders, not for the last time, if they will ever find Vivian Dulac, or if she'll be stuck with these two, now three utterly unfathomable creatures, for the rest of her long life. Nerissa does not in fact like to feed off rats, especially dead ones. But once she arrives back in her room, she takes Kit's offering. She's very hungry, and there's little other choice within the city itself, so at least after a few tries, she gets a handful of living rats and arranges them in a makeshift cage in her room. "The blood needs to be fresh, from living creatures," Nerissa tells Kit that evening, realizing she must be more direct. "I told you, I used to have a whole flock of goats for the sole purpose of maintaining sustenance, and sipping from rats just doesn't quite do the trick." Kit is hanging upside down over the back of the sofa, defying gravity in some strange way, her hair pooling on the thick carpet like black ink. Her eyes are closed, but she's been conversing like this for nearly a half hour, and has managed to hold up her end of things. Nerissa is finding herself surprisingly unbothered by Kit's curious behavior. "I'm more than willing to provide sustenance myself," Kit says, swaying slightly. "I don't even need my blood. It's just one of those curious vestigial effects of being intertwined with humankind. I replenish my blood supply very quickly. You know that Kitsune can even reproduce with human beings. It's quite common, actually." "Fascinating," Nerissa says, which is not the case at all. The Lamia wishes to know as little as possible about the Kitsune so she can go on with her life after this creature's sentence is up with him. "But I told you, I'm not comfortable. I don't know what you're used to being part of the Thousand Suns, but I'd rather not feed directly for food." Kit flips back up, hovering on the edge of the couch back for just a second before perching on the cushions with a wide grin. "Well, cultivating a whole mischief will be difficult." "A what now?" Nerissa asks. "A mischief? A group of rats is a mischief? Like a herd or a flock of goats, a murder of crows. They're useful words to know in English. English is a very strange language. It sounds like chewing and groaning at the same time." "You sound like a natural speaker," Nerissa says, going to the cabinet and searching for the map she's carried with her since Terrytown. They have been tracking rumors of Barkham since Vivian's disappearance, and while much of it Nerissa had to do from a distance, now that she's closer to the last place he was seen, she's eager to start plotting their next excursion. "I speak any language," Kit says, "with precision, or else I won't speak it at all. You really have no idea what I'm capable of, do you?" "I'm afraid that's Christabel's business," Nerissa says. "Ah, yes, they were looking at an area just outside of—" "How many people like yourself do you know?" Kit asks, "aside from Christabel and Worth at all?" "I'm not good at making friends," Nerissa says, which are more or less true, but definitely evading the question. Kit shakes her head. "I won't pry. Sorry, hold on a second. I'm just here to get you food, however that may be. I simply say that since you are trying to find someone, this Vivian you keep muttering about, then you ought to know the world you're playing in. You need to know the rules. You've already been pressed into buying something against your will, and you can't always have that clever unicorn around." "Are you implying I'm not clever?" "All things in their own measure," Kit says with a yawn. Nerissa deserves that, she supposes. Sorry, this is turning her back on the Kitsune and smoothing out one of the maps on her table. She flicks on the light, turns it down a notch, and traces her fingers across the route across the Atlantic, to London and then to Cairo. Kit is there, coolly looking at the maps, twirling her hair around her thumb. Nerissa tries to move them out of the way, but she realizes quickly that such an attempt is useless. Keeping Kit to the sidelines about this business is not going to be easy, especially with the way she keeps showing up at all hours with food tokens. Nerissa straightens and looks over at the Kitsune. "Well, how about this," says the Lamia. "We need the person responsible for taking our friend Vivian, and they're using antique jewels as currency." "That's quite curious," Kit says. "It is. He's an unconventional person, and he wants to avoid metal, so his payment is always almost in the form of lapis lazuli or sardonyx, or sometimes even amber. Regardless, they're odd, old stones and strange cuts. The Swiss banker named Claude de Beauce bought them last at an auction we found record of. His house isn't far from here, as he works for the Swiss consulate." "You want me to bite him?" asks Kit a little hopefully. Nerissa would very much like that, but has to learn to refine her responses and outward appearance enough to gently decline. What would be helpful is if you could let me do my research while you visit Mbaba. Someone purchased 6 camels there 2 days ago and paid some unconventional pieces. No ties to Davos, though. That's very specific. And I know a few things about payment, so if I please, no more distractions, Narissa says, interrupting with a flick of her hand. I'm too tired myself to go right now, and you seem brimming with energy. I need you to ask questions, get some descriptions, and figure out if they know anything about the transaction, providing you come back. I have to come back, Kit says, pulling aside her collar. There are 2 vials there, one filled with green liquid and another kind of silvery pink. Narissa and Worth's blood. She had wondered where they had gone off to, some minor charm then. If you need me more presently, just use this. Kit rummages in her pocket and retrieves a small bamboo pen. Use your spit, or your blood if you want. Write my name and I'll show up. Does this magic require the use of this precise pen? No, but it is more civilized, Kit says. Don't you think? Writing in blood with your fingertips is so very messy. And that's a peek at the next book. There's also a dwarf character. It's the first time I ever wrote a dwarf, which is funny since I write fantasy. And she can break off bits of her limbs to get out of problems. It takes a while for it to grow back, but I wanted to kind of create. Yeah, the dwarves are very strange.
I mean, in fairy tales, you have like people using fingers to unlock doors and stuff. So,
but she's made of rock, and so she eats rock, and she can taste rock and figure out what things are. But her skin is the color described as like maggot white because they live underground, so they have no need. She thinks she's the most gorgeous creature ever, and thinks all the other humans are just hideous, and she doesn't understand why people don't think she's just the most perfect specimen of dwarven kind. So it was really, really, really fun to write. And then there'll be another one coming out after that, which will finish the whole arc. And that one takes place in the 1940s. So I'm skipping a few. This was the 1920s. The last one was 19-teens. So
the one you were just reading, that book is out.
That book is out. Mask of Malevolence is coming out in about a month and a half.
Okay, cool.
So, and then there'll be an omnibus version of, I think it was supposed to be 4. I think it's going to be 3 because these are all very long novellas. Mm-hmm. So, Mask of Malevolence was like 53,000 words, which is technically a novel. This one is 2. This was 40,000. This was 40,000. I'm not good at writing short things. Mm-hmm. But when it's all done, it will be one single volume, and so you'll have the full novel. So, super fun. I feel like I found my voice with humor in this because I'm a very sarcastic person in real life, and I always crack jokes and make all kinds of inappropriate comments. And it was always really hard to find that voice in my writing. I was always very serious about my character. I mean, you read both ways. There's a little bit of banter, but like there's teeth monsters destroying people, and I'm serious about my craft. What I found is when I'm writing humor and characters that are so flawed, and it's a very close third person. You could just, the first book, Narissa's constantly talking about wanting to bite people's heads off. Like, that's just a great way for her to get rid of stress. But she can't do that because she's trying to help people. And just being so, plain and obvious about the monster's needs and desires just makes it so much fun to write. And the final fight scene in Mask of Malevolence takes place in an upside-down plane underneath the Kefri's the pyramid that has the limestone stone on the top. But it's not Khufu, it's the other. Kefri? Is it Kefri?
I think it's Kufre.
Kufre?
Something.
Yeah, it's a slightly lesser one, but there's so much cool stuff to read about it. So I got completely down the rabbit hole, which was awesome. But it's like in this upside down world where these the frog goddess is there, and she's like the main antagonist, and so these creepy frog people that to me look like Gollum in the Rankin Bass movies. I kind of wanted that to happen. And then there's tadpoles in the sand and all kinds of creepy shit. So it was just super fun. It's one of those choreographed fight scenes that it's all on stairs. They're trying to get to the top of the stairs. So there's a big reveal at the end of the second book. So I was happy with how the second one came out. I'd never written compartmentally like this. I've always sort of sat down to write the whole novel. So now I have these long episodes, and it's been really, really fun. And it's easier to write when you just every time you sit down you're laughing. They're just. I loved Kit. She was supposed to be a throwaway character, and she became a point of view character. And I'm going to keep her in the rest of the books because I love bringing in other. It starts very sort of Western European, but I really wanted to expand the Fae and magic and characters and bring all that in. So, and they are technically without race because they can. Most of them can kind of perform any gender or face they want through glamours, which is kind of an interesting way, but their cultural touchstones are still within English stuff. So I wanted to definitely branch out from there.
And what was the name of the first book in that
This
series?
is this one.
Sorry, not Wolfbook.
So Frost and Filigree.
Frost and Phil.
And that will be the name of the first of the whole omnibus. So Frost is Vivian; she can make things freeze, and Filigree is Narissa, who's got the sort of scaly kind of things, and their magic are two different things. And there's a little bit of there's more romance in this one than anything I've written recently, but it's all like unrequited love, which is great. It's like everyone loves people they can't be with, and I think that's just so much more fun. Because it's never fun when they get married and run off, and it's just not going to happen for them. But they live really long lives, and I love the idea of going through centuries and kind of having the different technologies in the worlds around them changing, and what it's like to start in a carriage and then be in a car and then have mass transit. So I thought it'd be really fun eventually to write like a short in like the 80s. Just see what they would have done. Like Vivian would probably be really, really into Madonna because she loves fashion, she loves design, she loves all these things. So it's just fun to play with characters that are that flexible.
Awesome.
So, but this is available in the in both of these are. So
At the Falstaff booth?
at the Falstaff booth, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for coming.